Greetings, fans of the NPL, and welcome back for another week of the NPL Minors Season 4 Power Rankings. I am your host, Richard, and I am not alone. I am joined by my wonderful co-host, Noah, aka No Pun Intended. What's going on, man?
I'm doing pretty good. It's good to be back after a week off, per se. I'd say that with the break week coming up for the coaches, I think the analysts, it's really just nice to have that break week come in so you can come back and do way better than you could have potentially if you were just doing things every single week. So it's good.
Yeah, definitely. And we do apologize for the lack of the ranks for the week 4. If you are interested and you are a coach or a member of the NPL community and have access to the minors document, the document is updated for week 4 of the power rankings. So if you are curious to know what ranks we gave you for week 4, you can go and check that out. Before we begin with the ranks for week 5, though, I do just have a few announcements to make. Now, last week we did have one coaching difference from week 3 to week 4. Parker and his North Carolina Tirana Tar Heels were taken over by Turbo and his Phoenix Midnights, so we now get to rank both of the Majors Power Rankers, which is kind of fun. And this week we are unfortunately saying goodbye to 3 more teams. The Montreal Habsols, similarly to the FC Poplio, have been promoted to play in the NPL Majors. Astor's spot in the minors will be filled by Techno and his Carolina Pantherians. The Portland Trailblazers dropped out and will be replaced by Turkey and his Toronto Luxrays. And lastly, the biggest shock of all, Mr. Undefeated, the coach of the Chicago Kyurem Blackhawks, Jar, will also be dropping out of the NPL minors. I do believe that his replacement has been announced, but he was unable to play the week 5 match, resulting in a forfeit. But now we can move on to our number 16 teams. I have the Toronto Luxrays, you have the Bullet Punch Club. Now, Turk is in a bit of a tough situation, having inherited the least competitive draft in the league and a very shaky team record. I will say that I like the fact that he has made several beneficial transactions in an attempt to strengthen the team, rather than just leaving it as a hopeless mean team, but this season will still be an uphill battle for him given the level of competition, as well as all the things that I previously mentioned. With that said, he did not play this week badly at all. I think the primary issues that he had were his inability to win the Hazard Control War, and subsequently his team getting very worn down by hazards. Despite being at number 16 in the ranks, there is a silver lining for the Toronto Luxrays, and that is the fact that in his conference standings, the teams from 4th to 7th place all have the same records, separated by only a few points of differential. Unfortunately for Turk, he's at the bottom of that group in 7th place, so he's definitely going to have to start winning some games if he wants to have a shot at overtaking the others and maybe making it to playoffs. Noah.
So number 16, I put the Bullet Punch Club. I think there's a bit of a synergy problem with Uzi's team. Now, I mentioned in the post-draft power rankings that if Uzi's team had a weakness, it was that it was vulnerable to the combination of stealth rocks and ground-type moves. Now I can definitively say that that point is a problem. Even with the free agency moves he's made, specifically getting a Rotom form that isn't weak to rocks, it's still an issue, especially when he's so reliant on Tentacruel to clear rocks and other hazards for him. This week, Greg took advantage of that fact, killing off the Tentacruel early with Mega Camerupt's Earth Power. Mega Diancie was also forced to take a Flamethrower from the Camerupt, and because Uzi couldn't get rid of the Stealth Rocks, he had to sack it as well in the end. I liked him bringing Banded Dragonite, but otherwise, Uzi's probably going to have to go tag out and plan his strategy better next week. He's got to find some kind of way to keep rocks off the field and to utilize his team's offensive potential. But moving on to number 15, I put down the Vancouver Stealth Rocks. Richard has the Bullet Punch Club that I just talked about. This is about where we get a bunch of teams that have 2 and 3 records and only have a couple points of differential that separate them. So, going into Carney, I'm not really able to talk too much about Carney's prep in this game because his NPL uploads have been rather lacking the past few weeks. He finally did get Landorus T to be a huge threat. He prepped very well against the Tones Mega Venusaur, and he kept the exact right mons they needed to at the end, saving Breloom to check the Zangoose, and Landorus for the extra drill are a couple of examples of that. He lived on low percentages a lot. That's either a sign of good EVing or blind luck. The large deficit that he has from earlier weeks prevent me from putting him higher than 15 as this week's lowest rated of the 9, 2, and 3 teams in the standings. But if you keep winning, that does mean that eventually you'll manage to rise to the top of those teams in that crowd. Richard.
Right, so for the Bullet Punch Club, it is kind of a shame that we have to put Uzi solo this week, and I do mean that genuinely. I think we all know how good of a competitor Uzi can be when he's on his game. Unfortunately, Uzi's performance these past few weeks has been slipping, and I think that a lack of motivation was playing a big role in that. With that said, he did play this game very closely. There were a few instances of Hex at the end that made it a little bit closer than it probably should have been, but he did put up a good fight and managed to slow down some of the momentum that his opponent had gained early on in the match. I do agree with all your points, Noah, about his weakness to Stealth Rock and ground moves. I do give Uzi a lot of credit though for sticking it out and wanting to make it to the end of the season. A couple of our coaches that left seem to have done so primarily out of a lack of motivation, so I do find it commendable that Uzi is continuing to push through, and I do hope that he can maybe find a bit more motivation going into the second half of the season and finish stronger than he started. But moving on to our number 14 teams, We both actually have the Rose Radenborg. Dan got a forfeit win this week against the Chicago Kyurem Blackhawks, as I said in the intro. Jar is unfortunately leaving us, and a replacement for him was unable to be found before this match was set to be played, leading to a forfeit in Dan's favor. Dan is at my number 14 this week because in my rankings for the previous week I had moved him down to number 14, and as Dan did not actually play his opponent this week, there was nothing to analyze, thus there was no reason to move him up or down. You guys know how it goes, and not much more needs to be said. Noah.
I definitely agree with you on that. For me, Dan has been in position 11 for the entire power rankings until weeks 4 and 5. He's been putting his monsters in face-down defense position this entire time, but finally, we were able to break through his life points and change his ranking at some point. Unfortunately, it has to be a move down because, all things considered, Dan is 1-3 in games that were not forfeited. The good news is that with a bunch of teams with the same nominal record, he does still have a little under half the season to catch up. But going to number 13, I have the Colorado Avalugs. Richard has the Vancouver Stealth Rocks. I did like Keegan's double switch against Shaman because Shaman is just plain annoying to face off against unless you know its moveset. He did misplay with the Jolteon when Ethan had no ice resist remaining on his team. He mentioned that it was possible to outspeed Garchomp with a +1 Charizard X, but in reality, Garchomp has a higher base speed, and it makes no sense to not at least speed creep the Zardex. So I wouldn't call it as much of a misplay as much as covering his tracks against a potential Jolly Scarf, which, if I were in Ethan's position, that's the set I would have gone with. The misplay wasn't Dragon Dancing on the Gallade. I mean, maybe he thought it was bulky, but he would need the speed to outspeed Keldeo and could have gotten more damage as a result. I think this game for Keegan was generally good, but I moved him down quite a bit after his Week 4 game, and if we had actually recorded a video for that, I would have gone ham on him. But instead, he's just going to stay here. Richard.
So for the Vancouver Stealth Rocks, this was a very blow-for-blow match, especially early on, a very offensive game. Carney played this game fairly well. It was a pretty straightforward match, so I don't have a whole lot to say on it. I think that the reason that Carney, despite his win this week, is so low for both of us is because he is in last place in this conference, and while a similar race is happening in Carney's conference as in Turk's, Carney has the lowest differential out of all the teams by a few points, and his chances for making playoffs seem pretty slim, but I would not mind being proven wrong in that regard. But we can move on now to our number 12 teams. I have the Colorado Avalugs. Noah, you have the Toronto Luxrays, and despite his loss and his position on my power rankings this week, Keegan's performance in his match against the Tennessee Dynamos actually really impressed me. He made a number of good reads, particularly early in the game, and his prep seemed very solid for the most part. And I say for the most part because it was very clear in the match, particularly in the latter portion of the game, but it was also apparent early on that Shaman was a huge annoyance for the Avalugs this week. Keegan struggled to get favorable matchups against the Shaman and the Crobat, and he just couldn't manage to break them down. Meanwhile, his own mons were getting very slowly worn down, which ultimately led to him getting swept by Tennessee's Mega Gallade late in the game. Noah.
So at number 12, I put the Toronto Luxrays. Now, Turk mentioned that after getting rid of Wobbuffet on his team that he's not about the trap life, but he still has Magnezone and he picked up Dugtrio on his team. So either he's endearingly ironic or he's the biggest fraud in the NPL. Now, I know Turk, and Turk does about 40 mocks per game, and that's not an exact number, obviously, it's an estimate. So he always appears like he's prepped for everything. And the best example I can find in his game was running Pursuit Dugtrio, predicting a Shed Shell on the Victini. It's a huge risky moveset choice, but he got it right. And he also knew that the Mega Absol could easily run a special move like Thunderbolt to hit the pincer super effectively, so it is very clear he's aware of what his opponents will run. His game against Techno was a very high-level match, and usually when you have two very good players playing pretty much optimally the whole time, one or two plays will determine who wins the game, and unfortunately for Turk, 20 turns of solid play can't outdo 3 turns where Techno made the right reads and clinched the game. I still think Turk is good enough to win games with his squad, and this loss was more circumstantial than anything. But going on to number 11, Richard and I both have the Houston Soul Rockets. It's refreshing to see Adam bounce back from an 0-2 start without having to rely on an interim coach doing the work for him. He's used the same sort of strategy that he did against Astros, Cobalion, Mamoswine, and Salmons this week against Fallop. Diggersby has been his MVP for most of the season, as he always seems to bring the most effective set possible for it. And the game, much like the previous one that I talked about, came down to a set of prediction-based 50-50s at the end. And Adam ended up making the wrong prediction, thinking Fallop would predict Diggersby switching in at that turn. In that case, there's really not much movement I have for either coach in the power rankings, and any changes I would make were mostly because other teams passed them or fell below them. Richard.
So this is yet another example of a coach who lost this week, but whose playing really genuinely impressed me. The ways he played around Sticky Web and Fallop's Z-Fly, Dragon and Salamence were really expertly done. Unfortunately, Adam's Nihilego got a bit of a low roll on its power gem, meaning that the Salamence survived and was able to take out the Nihilego. Adam still had Quick Attack on Diggersby though, which was able to come in and finish off the Salamence. However, what the loss of Nihilego means is that he has one less potential thing to throw at Fallop's Sash Alakazam, which ends up forcing Adam to play through a series of 50-50s. He wins them all right up until the last one, where he failed to predict the Alakazam Shadow Ball, leaving his Mew in to die. He mentioned that the play was a little bit rushed and he should have thought it through like he thought through the others. And then Alakazam, after taking a Scarfed Diggersby's return with its Focus Sash, was able to take out the Diggersby with a Focused Blast. But now we can move on to our number 10 teams. I have the main red Clawitzers, Noah has the Rotterdam Star Raptors. For the Clawitzers, Ice Beam on Clefable was a great way to deal with Carney's Lando T, and it prevented the Lando T from becoming too big of a problem for the Clawitzers. Unfortunately, I think that Carney's offense overall was just too overwhelming for Tone to handle this week. He didn't really have very many switch-ins to Carney's threats, and he wasn't able to get enough momentum in his favor to pull the match back all the way, and momentum is crucial when it comes to offensive and hyper-offensive matchups. Noah.
So talking about the Rotterdam Star Raptors, Freeze actually brought 3 Wish Passers to this game. Like, oh my gosh, man, I would never have the guts to do something like that. He played into Ace's offense especially well. Now, Freeze's bulk has been generally outclassed this season, but without many options for setup on Ace's Week 5 team, the Staraptors were just able to live attacks over and over again and recover their HP. Special mention goes to Gliscor, who walled Anaheim's Krookodile, Golbat, and Darmanitan, and Leafeon showed could actually be a decent team player by taking out the Azumarill with a Bloom Doom. But the pivotal play of the game was going for Sludge Wave with Specs Gengar on the Thunderous T, removing Ace's best offensive win condition and allowing his Wish Passers and Gliscor to handle the rest of the Altaria's offensive threats. So going on to number 9, both Richard and I have the Los Angeles Clefable. Greg's team is an example in why having a bunch of potential Stealth Rock setters can give you such an advantage in team prep. We saw last week that Greg was able to wear down Keegan's Mandibuzz by repeatedly forcing it in on rocks and isolating Keegan's Lone Hazard remover in Dhelmise. And this week, Greg did much the same thing by popping the Tentacruel with Mega Camerup's Earth Power twice. Using Trick Room against a decently fast team was also a great bring, because he has some super threatening slow breakers, and Uzi's team was just a bit too fast to creep under their speeds. The 0-0 differential score was not indicative of how this game went. Greg deserved the win in the end. It is unfortunate he doesn't get differential off it, because with his current record the way it is, he could use it, but still, great play all around on his end. Richard.
I like that Greg went into this week with a plan to use a combination of hazards and offensive momentum to weaken the Bullet Punch Club's team to the point where Greg's priority users in Weavile and Crawdaunt could finish things off, and he executed it nearly flawlessly, making some excellent plays in the early game and firmly grasping that momentum. We already discussed the nail-biting endgame when we talked about Uzi, but Greg's glory-seeking Mega Camerupt perished to an unexpected Dragonite set, and then the hacks very nearly put Greg in a position to lose, but he was able to clinch a very narrow 0-0 victory, and very well deserved. But moving on to our number 8 teams, I have the Phoenix Midnights, Noah has the main red Clawitzers. Turbo showed the absolute threat that Mega Lopunny is in this game, putting a lot of pressure on Mio's team and picking up several kills. He managed to play around the Porygon 2, tricking it with Frostless's Choice Scarf late in the game, which removed its Eviolite and made it much easier for Lopunny to kill. One of the things that I especially liked about Turbo's playing is that he accounted for every contingency with Tapu Koko, particularly the Choice Scarf, and played around it as if it were, even though it was not, but in a way that still was effective and enabled him to get a safe win over Mio. Noah.
So going on to the main red Clawitzers, this game is a lesson as to why playing your battles at 2 AM is not a good idea. Now, while Tone was forced to sack off his Clefable and his Excadrill, the pivotal play of the game, in my opinion, was losing Mega Venusaur to the Specs Raiku's Extra Sensory. Now, had that been me, and it hadn't been 2 in the morning, I would have been a huge chicken and preserved Venusaur by any means necessary. But obviously, other coaches had different mindsets in that moment, so I can't necessarily say whether that would have been the best play. Ultimately, Tone's offense was just a bit too frail to survive Carney's bulk, and his earlier misplays around Gothitelle and Raikou cost him a potential win. It's pretty disappointing, considering Tone's losses are usually more luck-based than skill-based, but this week is the exception for him so far this season, and he still has a lot of differential points anyway, which is why, even though he has a losing record, I put him in the top half of the rankings. Also, get some flying ground resist. I know that free agency is almost over, and I don't know how many transactions have left, but it might be a bit helpful in the future. But going to number 7, I have the Phoenix Midnights, Richard has the Anaheim Altarias. In this game, Turbo was able to read Mio's team like what Librarian does with his Stockade. Is that even a word that people use? I'm just going to go with it. He was able to counter Drapion with a hard prediction, going for Earth Power with the Celebi. He managed to Trick Scarf the Porygon 2, completely mitigating its defensive potential, because what good is Porygon 2 if it can't go for an attacking move when it wants to? I did notice a lot of speed control on Turbo's behalf in his team builder. He put Scarfs on both the Celebi and the Frostlass. Mega Lopunny was especially important because of Fake Out and 135 base speed, and Mio couldn't get good switch-ins into it whenever it came in, because of the threat of high jump kick. It was a very good choice by Turbo to bring it, as well as to scout for Protect whenever it came in, and because of that high skill level, I have him here. Richard.
So the Altarias this week brought tons of offensive threats with a lot of wall-breaking potential, but he really struggled to get enough momentum for them to gain favorable matchups against Rotterdam's Mons. This game was very long and essentially came down to Ace's Mons getting chipped away gradually without having much in the way of recovery, which is what I consider to be Anaheim's fatal flaw, as it were, and then just getting outlasted by Rotterdam's bulk. But moving on to our number 6 teams, I have the opponent of the Anaheim Altarias, the Rotterdamster Raptors. Noah, you have the Anaheim Altarias themselves, and Freeze did a fantastic job of playing around with the Z Thunderous T in this match, making all sorts of predictions on it, forcing it to burn Z Crystal to negligible effect, burning it with the Will-O-Wisp from Mega Gardevoir, and then eventually taking it out with Gengar's Sludge Wave. I really like the triple Cleric core of Mega Gardevoir, Lickilicky, and Leafeon, all of which were carrying Wish this week. Freeze is really putting his lower tier mons to good use, which I like to see. Leafeon actually picked up a nice kill this week, like you said, with its Z move Bloom Doom against the Azumarill, and it also picked up another kill against the Crocodile, so that's awesome. I definitely enjoyed that. Like I said earlier about the Anaheim Altarias, I think Freeze's team this week exposed the flaw in Anaheim's team that I have been stating and restating since the preseason rankings, and that is the fact that most of Ace's team, especially his more offensive threats, do not have reliable recovery and are very susceptible to getting worn down over an extended period of time, and Freeze was able to capitalize on that perfectly and build a team that could outlast Anaheim's. Noah.
Talking about the Altarias, Rotterdam's opponent in this game, I agree with Ace in his commentary that his prep wasn't the problem, but more so his actual play in the match. He had no hazard removal whatsoever and forced Golbat and Darmanitan to take a bunch of switch-in damage from rocks, but the game was lost when he let Thunderous T feint to Specs Gengar Sludge Wave. From there, Freeze had a good switch-in for every Mon that Ace had left. The Darmanitan was caught in Rock's range, Crook couldn't touch the Gliscor, even if it somehow carried Aqua Tail, it still wouldn't have been able to. And that's the issue with offense. It's a very high-risk, high-reward strategy, because you have very few Mons you can fall back on if you're under pressure. And Ace unfortunately just couldn't come back from losing Thunderous T and Azumarill. While he's still 3-2, the fact that he's on a losing streak, as well as making so many incorrect reads in this game, convinced me to put him lowest of all the teams in the league that have a winning record. But going on to number 5, both Richard and I have put the Oklahoma City Thunderous. Mio mentioned that he couldn't find ways to pressure Turbo's Mega Lopunny. With his team's more offensive build, a really fast, really strong Mon like Mega Lopunny will put a lot of pressure. He mentioned a lot of damage rolls and potential crits that put him in a bad position. Turbo could just fake out and high jump kick every Mon on his team, because if Turbo made the proper prediction and went straight for high jump kick, Mio could have lost one of his Mons every single time, and thus Mio played directly into Turbo's hand. Now, while Mio's team is pretty fast, especially this week, it's also vulnerable if his opponents have Mons like Mega Lopunny, so that's something he's going to have to watch out for in future weeks. But Mio's still high on the rankings because he's still pretty darn consistent, even with this latest setback. Richard.
So, the takeaway I got from this game is that Porygon 2 is very fat, leading me to believe that Mio has a BBW fetish. Seriously, it wouldn't die. It just wouldn't die. But moving on, Mio seemed to be a bit of a crit magnet this week. How many of them actually mattered, I'm not sure, but it definitely didn't help his situation. I think that if he had run Protect on Porygon 2, Mega Lopunny would have been much easier to deal with, because Porygon 2 is so bulky that it essentially forces Turbo to run his most powerful stab fighting move, which on Mega Lopunny is High Jump Kick, so unless Turbo had a surefire way of removing the Eviolite, he would have had to run High Jump Kick unless he wanted to get into a stall war with Drain Punch and risk getting status by Tri-Attack, so Protect definitely would have made a lot of sense, but that's just a bit of hindsight. And now we can move on to our number 4 teams. I have the Dewford Drapions, Noah, you have the Carolina Pantherians. For the Dewford Drapions, Fallop won. It was a good win, it was a really close match, and I don't mean to take anything away from him by my next comments, but after the point in the match where he lost his hazards and neglected to set up a second Dragon Dance with Salamence, it really just seemed like he was more reactive in the match than proactive, like he was more just responding to the plays that Adam was making as opposed to making the plays himself. And one could argue that this is because he still had a lot of momentum in his favor and didn't really need to, but he very nearly lost the game at the end by losing most of the 50-50s, and again, it seemed more like Adam was the one making the plays, thinking through the 50-50s correctly, figuring out his ways to win, and trying to force those into effect, and Fallop was just reacting to them and going with the flow, which definitely worked out for him, but more because Adam faltered, and it wasn't like some of the other matches this week where both players were forced to make plays and predictions right up until the end. Noah.
So when talking about the Carolina Pantherians, I can refer back to many of the same things I said about the Toronto Luxrays earlier. This game was a very evenly matched affair for both Techno and Turkey. I did like Techno's decision to run Toxic Spikes against a team that relied on tapping Finny as an anti-status measure. Finny is a mon that's very, very prone to repeated pressure just because it doesn't have the best ways to recover its HP. Meanwhile, Techno was able to use his fat wall Hippowdon very well, knowing what mons it could counter, and using that as a switch advantage, doubling whenever necessary to seize the momentum. He was able to find a good balance between playing conservatively and aggressively, and even though he has a 4-run record, I'm still a bit hesitant to put him high just because he's only played one game, and I feel like I want to see something more consistent from him in future weeks before I move him into the top 3. But speaking of top 3, at number 3, I have the Jupiter Drapions. Richard has the previously mentioned Carolina Pantherians. It's good to see Foul pick up the remains of Aster's team, picking up Cobalion, Mamoswine, and Salmons in free agency, 3 very successful mons this season. Unfortunately, he didn't learn very much from Aster's game against Adam earlier and didn't predict the Scarf from the Lego, otherwise Salmons would have had a much easier time winning. Foul was the victor because of the 50-50 string at the end I mentioned in Adam's segment earlier. He picked up the win because luck is good for him, but this game didn't bump up his ranking a ton for me, but instead he has 2 other wins that we haven't talked about before on this program, and he generally plays smart with a lot of awareness as to what goes on in his battles. He's got a good chance to get promoted in spite of the fact that he inherited a team with a pretty poor start. Richard.
So for the Carolina Pantherians, I think we can finally call off the search party for Tapu Bulu. We saw Aster using it last week for the first time against Carney. Carney may have lost some of Lando T's EVs along the way, but hey, sacrifices need to be made, you know? And Techno did make Tapu Bulu a huge threat in this match as well. He was able to get hazards up and keep them up, keeping the pressure on the Luxray's team, thus enabling him to wear down the opposing mons to the point where Mega Absol was able to finish off the last few. I was really happy to see Mega Absol do some good work. It was the first Mega, and I think maybe even the first Mon that I ever drafted in a draft league way back in Season 3 of the NPL Majors, so there's that. In Week 4, I put Montreal at number 3. I'm keeping the Carolina Pantherians at number 3 this week because it is Techno's first week in action. He did win though, so I will allow him to ride Aster's former success and remain in the top 3, but I am eager to see if Techno can maintain that success in the future weeks. But moving on to our number 2 teams, I have the Tennessee Dynamos, Noah you have the Chicago Kyurem Blackhawks. So this game would probably have my vote for Game of the Week. I already said that Keegan really impressed me back when I talked about the Colorado Avalugs, and Ethan was also extremely impressive in this game, and both coaches showed what playing at a very high level looks like. Ethan in this game utilized the core of Shaman and Crobat to great effect. They were essentially able to wall Keegan's team. Shaman sponged the hits and healed off the damage, and Crobat was able to weaken things with Brave Bird and shut down Keegan's utility mons with Taunt. I think what really shows how solid Ethan's team this week was, though, is the fact that Ethan was the recipient of a couple crits in this game. Only one was particularly crucial, as it cost Ethan his Rotom Wash, and then Shaman just sort of shrugged off the Icy Wind crit from Keldeo, but in both instances, Ethan's team was solid enough that the team could still function successfully and overcome the bad luck. Noah.
So, I don't really have much to say about the Chicago Kyurem Blackhawks. On the one hand, Jar has had more of a positive sample size than Ethan has had, and he has the best record and differential in the league at the end of Week 4, but on the other, he just forfeited. It feels a bit dirty to put a coach who forfeited a match that particular week at number 1, so I felt to put him on number 2 just to make a point. But going on to my number 1 team, I have the Tennessee Dynamos. Richard, you have the Chicago Kyurem Blackhawks. Shaman was a very important performer for Ethan, as it's been most of the season. Leech Seed was able to chip away at Keegan's walls that couldn't touch the Shaman. Crobat was able to weaken things with Brave Bird, which put Garchomp and Mega Gallade into positions where they could clean up the game at the end. He was the beneficiary of Keegan's itchy trigger finger and not clicking Dragon Dance as the Gallade set up a bulk up. He played decently, his record is 4-1, I think he's just the best performing team, and he's got a very, very solid record that should carry him at least into the conversation for getting promoted in the future. And so far, no one's been able to stop his offensive core yet. Richard.
So, the reason that I have the Chicago Kyurem Blackhawks at number 1 this week, despite his loss by forfeit, is because up until this point, Jar had gone undefeated, and he still technically did not lose this match, given that he did not actually end up playing it. We will be saying goodbye to Jar after this week, so I thought, why not honor him for one last week by keeping him at the number 1 position. And lastly, I just want to say, great job this season, Jar, if you are watching. It's unfortunate that you weren't able to continue on, as I would have loved to see how far you actually could have made it, but both of us wish you good luck in whatever is to come.
Definitely. I just want to confirm that I agree with everything you said about Jar.
Awesome. Alright, so I think that will conclude our power rankings for this Week 5 of the NPL Minors Season 4. We're about halfway through the season. It's going to get pretty intense in the coming weeks, as the teams that are all very close to each other will be vying for that position to get into the playoffs, and the teams who are ahead have to keep their teams ahead of the game in order to actually ensure that their places in the playoffs are rather safe. So we're going to be looking out for that. It's going to be pretty cool analyzing these next few weeks. Noah, do you have any last things to say to the people watching before we end this?
I just want to give a shout out to some of the interim coaches that have been joining this league. Like, we talked about how in general there's been a bit of a stark difference somewhat between some of the higher end coaches and some of the lower end coaches. But many of the coaches who are taking over teams that they haven't had usage yet are really bringing the fire this season. They are not afraid to make plays, and they're really upping the competition level in the league so far. So to all of you guys, thank you so much for coming on. And for all the coaches who have stayed on, thank you for coming on as well. And for all the coaches who have left, thank you for giving your time to the league for however long that you did. It's very much appreciated.
Yeah, definitely have to agree with all of those sentiments there. But with that said, thank you guys so much for watching. We're going to end this here, and have a good day.